Peter's confession of Christ. When Jesus came to the region of Caesarea Philippi, he questioned his disciples, "Who do people say the Son of Man is?" They replied, "Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and still others, Jeremiah or one of the prophets." "But what about you?" Jesus asked. "Who do you say I am?" 16 Simon Peter answered, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." Jesus replied, "Blessed are you, Simon son of Jonah. For this was not revealed to you by flesh and blood, but by my Father in heaven. And I tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not prevail against it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven." Then he admonished the disciples not to tell anyone that he was the Christ. Verse 21. From that time on Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things at the hands of the elders, chief priests, and scribes, and that he must be killed and on the third day be raised to life. Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. "Far be it from you, Lord," he said, "this shall never happen to you." Verse 23. But Jesus turned and said to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me. For you do not have in mind the things of God, but the things of men."
Peter, having just declared that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of the living God, now attempts to rebuke Jesus when he speaks of his impending suffering, death, and resurrection. In verse 23, Jesus responds dramatically to Peter, saying, "Get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me, for you do not have in mind the things of God, but the things of men." Now here's Jesus calling Peter Satan, the devil. Peter is confused, wondering, why are you calling me Satan? Imagine Peter looking at Jesus as Jesus calls him his adversary and tells him that he is a stumbling block, or the word scandalon, which means a stick for bait, for a trap, a snare, a stumbling block, an offense, an impediment. I'm sure Peter was confused about Jesus speaking such harsh words against him, even calling him his adversary, his opposition. Peter did not understand that his feelings allowed his judgment to be clouded and his discernment misaligned. He was attempting to interfere with the divine plan for Jesus Christ. Though Peter knew exactly who Jesus was, namely the Messiah, the Son of the living God, he also held common Jewish misconceptions about the Messiah's mission. Many Israelites awaited a king who would overthrow the oppressive Roman rule. Consequently, Peter refused to accept Jesus' warning of the judgment, mistreatment, and death he anticipated. After trying to convince the Lord that such an end was impossible, the disciple was rebuked for attempting to subvert God's will. Jesus' priority was to liberate hearts from sin rather than bodies from tyranny. Let's proceed. This exchange between Jesus and Peter is a big lesson for all of us. Sometimes, even with the best intentions, we can get in God's way. Peter's rebuking Jesus wasn't rooted in malice. To the contrary, it stemmed from his love and devotion to Christ. He couldn't bear the thought of Jesus, the Son of God, going through such a terrible fate. But here's the key. Peter's response, though well-meaning, was based on human perspective rather than divine understanding. Did you get that? How often do we, like Peter, try to resist or reshape God's plan because it doesn't align with our expectations, and we become a stumbling block to God's work in our lives and in the lives of others when we hold on to our human reasonings, desires, or fears rather than seeing and surrendering to God's purpose and will. We may not say it aloud, but when we try to control outcomes, make decisions out of fear, or push our own agenda and narrative, we are essentially saying to God, "My way is better than yours." Jesus' words to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan," is jarring. They tell us that anything opposing God's plan, no matter how noble it may seem, is not just a misunderstanding, but in direct opposition to his divine will. Peter in that moment was not seeing and grasping the bigger picture, that Christ's suffering was necessary for salvation, that through his death would come victory over sin and death itself. What we need to recognize is that God's ways are higher than our own. In Isaiah 55:8-9, God tells us that his thoughts are not our thoughts, nor are his ways our ways. We may not always understand the path he sets before us, but it is in these moments of confusion or discomfort that we are called to trust him the most. When God's plans don't align with our hopes or expectations, it is an invitation to surrender to his will and not our own. So how do we avoid getting in God's way? The first step is humility. Unlike Peter, we must acknowledge that we don't always see the full picture. What looks like suffering or loss to us may be part of God's greater plan for redemption, growth, or blessing. We must learn to lay aside our limited understanding and trust in God's infinite wisdom. The second step is alignment with God's will. Jesus tells Peter that he has in mind the things of men and not the things of God. To avoid becoming a stumbling block, we need to actively seek the things of God first and not our own way. Let us seek to trust God's wisdom over our own, to align our hearts with his will, and to follow him in faith, even when we don't fully understand the path ahead. In doing so, we will not get it God's way, but will instead become vessels through which his perfect plan can unfold. Peter had a narrow view of the divine plan, and a wrong perception led him into open rebellion. Let's not make his mistake. Since we never want to obstruct God's unfolding purpose, it's always wise to seek his will first, even when unpleasant circumstances appear to warrant a compassionate response. Let us get out of God's way. May God bless and keep you, my friends, in Jesus' holy and precious name. Amen.